Despite the community backlash, dexterity scaling lightning weapons was a brilliant decision. Please don't kill me and hear me out. Faith is a very favored and beloved stat. From the very first time we saw the boltofgransax being used in a trailer, we assumed it was going to have faith scaling. But when you finally made it to the capital, you climb up the colossal spear and finally take a look at the weapon. You feel robbed. As a faith player, it happened to be dexterity. Why is it not faith? It was faith in the previous games. So let's look at why they would make this decision, and honestly, I believe there's 3 reasons behind it. Those being balance, thematics, and legendary weapons. Alright, before I go further, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. I know this is a small new channel, and I would love to hear your input, any comments below, any likes, but if you subscribe, it would be an incredible amount of help. Thank you for being awesome, and enjoy the video. Let's look at balance, specifically faith. Faith is quite easily the strongest stat in Elden Ring by far. They easily have the best weapons, spells, and buffs, while having the capability of doing every single damage type in the game. They will not necessarily need any lightning-based weapons with what they're already given, as their versatility and damage and capabilities are incredibly high. Now, on the contrary, let's look at dexterity on a more objective level. So what edge does dexterity have over other stats? Let's look at different archetypes, different styles in which people would assume dexterity would do better, be it in Elden Ring or any other interpretation. First, stealth. Does dexterity have an edge over stealth? Absolutely not. If you want to go stealth, the best thing to go is a cult or a death mage. Dexterity gets no benefit in that regard whatsoever. Let's say dexterity is faster, so it attacks faster, right? No, absolutely not. Arcane definitely has the edge up, but really any stat can attack at the same speed as any other. Strength could even do better, especially early on, especially when you look at things like Flaming Strike. Strength can use the same weapons as dexterity, depends on the affinity and the specific weapon you're using, rather than the base scale of the weapon. You can look and test through the ARs of different weapons, you're going to find how good strength can actually be, especially with the fire affinity. Alright, how about crits? Dexterity has to have like an advantage of crits, right? Especially thinking about like the Messicore or the Rapier. Well, thing is, especially when you look at the Messicore, it does effectively the same damage on every stat. So the Messicore really doesn't work or pan out in that way. So let's go and reevaluate and look at what dexterity is known for, what the strongest dexterity build is. And you're going to find the bleed builds. And although dexterity might seem like the critical stat for bleed builds, it is not. The better stat for bleed builds, especially later on in the game, is going to be arcane. When you build a bleed build, especially later on in the game, you're going to find that it makes less and less sense to build dexterity, as you could build raw faith and arcane and gain a 20, 30, 40% increase in damage through buff among other means, as well as going occult, rather than getting a 5 to 10% increase from investing into dexterity. And while you could argue that, yes, you could beat the game with a dexterity build, yes, dexterity is on its own a viable way to play the game. Just because something is viable, just because it can be played throughout the game, does not mean it is good as the other stats, and it does not mean it's balanced, it does not mean it is the optimal decision, and it does not mean it is competitive. When I say this, I'm saying it is not competitive compared to Arcane. It is not competitive compared to Strength. It is not competitive compared to Faith. It is not competitive compared to Magic. Given that little bit of extra niche, that little extra damage, even if it's still not as good, it's still helpful. So let me contextualize what I mean by a viable build. Really, any build in the game can be viable. You see a lot of challenges throughout the game playing different builds, and any build that can get you to the very end is viable. A rune level 1 build is a viable build. It does not mean it's an optimal build. It does not mean that it is going to get most players through it. And yes, a straight dex build, especially when you remove the lightning scaling, is far from optimal. Given that lightning scaling is fantastic because it at least gives it an additional edge, it gives it that additional power, but without that, it's suboptimal. Like, you may as well go other options, because other options are going to be better. And when you want to look at the game at a more, like, let's say PvP perspective, yeah, like as I said, you're going to find literally every build is going to be better than a dexterity build, even with the lightning weapons and lightning ashes of war. Even with Keen, it really doesn't matter. And yes, blood loss, you're better with, of course, arcane. So just because it is a better option does not necessarily mean that you're not going to see people play dexterity builds, yeah, they still work. You'd beat somebody playing a dexterity build doing less damage than that than when they're playing a faith build, and that faith build could even be able to retreat and heal their health all the way. That does not mean that dexterity is better. They have less options. They're doing worse at literally every single category of the game, and yet they still win. That does not make dexterity better. In fact, they have less options. There's less ability to zone around. Your ability to attack them, your melee abilities are going to be doing less damage to them. And if you're thinking about, yes, what about the bleed builds from earlier? Arcane does it better. You're better off going Arcane with that. And guess what? You would have the access to incantations, which means you'd be able to zone out and do effective damage and scaling with those incantations, and invest into faith rather than dexterity, because it's going to give you that edge and damage beyond what you're going to get with investing in dexterity, because a 30% increase is much better than a 5 to 10% increase. That being said, build it what you want to anyways, because you understand that PvP in general is a lot more strategy than anything else, and given dexterity, these options allows it to at least throw the opponents off. Elden Ring is typically in a relatively healthy state, in my opinion, in terms of total balance. It is mostly a PvE game with some PvP elements. That is because when you actually get the edge in PvP and you actually go on the offensive and catch your enemies off guard, you'll be able to take out your enemies fast enough to the point where that damage doesn't matter all too much. That being said, outside of balance, let's look at thematics. The theme of lightning and lightning being more or less skill or speed related technically came from Sekiro, because the use of lightning and lightning reversal has been shown in Sekiro to be much more speed and skill related rather than anything of the divine. Although there's some evidence of it being of the divine, of course Tome herself used to be a divine heir, which is where Genshiro got the skill from. He did not get the power from, of course, Tome. That is pretty obvious and a huge part of the plot of the game. He specifically learned the skill from Tome. Tome taught it to him and passed it down. The dragon itself, the divine dragon that you end up getting the tears from, has some reference to lightning with it. The skill itself is not, and this right here does not seem too bizarre because thematically and culturally it kind of makes sense. Lightning speed is a reference for a reason, and yes, lightning speed is usually referred to relatively fast-paced dexterous combat. And speaking of dexterous combat, let's look at where red lightning or ancient dragon lightning comes in Elden Ring. It comes from storms. It is specifically the power storms harnessed by dragons when they use their abilities. And yes, ancient dragons are the most dexterous dragons of the game. The thematics make sense. Not only that, the power of runes are canon to the game. So it kind of makes sense that these ancient dragons, which are the first entities to use the runes of the Elden Ring, focus on dexterity as their main attribute. And talking about storms, let's demystify something here, are quality based. And we know this through the Ashes of War, which are quality based. Which, yes, dexterity is a part of quality. So yes, a more refined version of a storm makes sense to be much more dexterous rather than the raw brute force. When we look at, let's say, the Dragon Colts, now there has been attempts at replications to become a dragon in Elden Ring, and that is all faith-based. But usually that results in some brutal monstrosities that are not necessarily dragon, but dragon-like. Unnatural and hideous. It kind of makes sense that when you're trying to go for a certain power, but go into the wrong direction, you're going to get a brutal mutation. Hell, the only two entities that we know that use red lightning outside of the ancient dragons themselves is Vike, as well as the draconic tree sentinels. And they had to give up a huge part of their humanity in order to become something beyond that. Now Vike is not necessarily a good example because he is obviously a good example of a Dex Faith build. And of course, the draconic tree sentinels, their weapons and their shield scale off of strength and dexterity, so that kind of falls flat there. Okay, it would fall flat if it weren't for the fact that they are actually successful versions of kind of Dragonkin soldiers, as they actually gain the draconic attributes while having to not deal with the brute grotesque mutations of the Dragon Communion. Of course, they're not truly what they used to be, but at the same time, at least they're not in a worse state than what they previously were. And they sacrifice something in order to protect the Earth Tree itself. And it is actually quite critical that they are actually using red lightning, because although there may be an argument that some may bring up that red lightning should be Faith scaling, that is actually the opposite from the cape. Yellow lightning, especially when you look at the Gravelstone seal, is the one that implies that it should be Faith scaling, as when you read it, it implies that lightning is a beauty gold. And specifically, they're talking about yellow lightning or gold lightning. Which, yes, means that there is like a genuine argument that Faith can have some sort of lightning scale within a weapon. Does it really need it? No. Should it really have it? In my opinion, there probably yes. Like, I think there should have been. But it probably should not have been better than the lightning dexterity weapons for various reasons, including just having objectively better options anyways. Speaking of options as well as thematics and balance as a whole, let's look at legendary weapons and what the allocation is for each stat. The biggest critical reasons on why dexterity definitely deserves something in terms of a fantastical type. And let's start off with Faith, the one that people argue lightning probably should go towards. Faith has 4 out of 9 of them. Strength has 2 out of 9. Intelligence 2 out of 9. Arcane also 2 out of 9. Dexterity has 1. That is the Bolt of Gransax. This makes sense as a legendary weapon embody the very fantastical nature of each power. The power you get from the runes are all canon after all. Let's be real, the expectation of lightning being Faith comes from Dark Souls. Specifically, the god Gwyn, and beyond that, it actually more comes from Dark Souls 3, in which the armaments are empowered by Faith. But that is only one game. Let's assume that we could give Dex a different fantastical property. What would it be? Well, the only thing that would come to mind, realistically, would be Destined Death, at least thematically in what we've seen with Ashes of War. And the repercussions is that would change the game entirely. You would have to change in parts of the lore, and just to keep strength and dex still unique from each other, you would have to probably add in the dark damage type in order to add in that additional distinction. And honestly, these games weren't made for that. Holy was the equivalent of dark within the previous games. To add in a whole nother damage type might sound like just a little bit, that could be quite a lot. There'd be arguments on why that would not go to Faith, and honestly, I think realistically, it probably would have been added to the Death, Sorcery, damage type, which means it would be mostly a Dex and Intelligence kind of build, and that would cause a lot of confusion and a lot of complaints. So the real reason why it was a brilliant idea is because it's thematically appropriate, it works with the game, it gives Dex a weapon that is legendary, in fact, probably in my opinion a bit too legendary, while also just kind of allowing for the game to be at least more balanced thematically and giving every single power and every single element a thematic element to it. And realistically, there was no better option. Like, you're not really given one. Yes, it did cause some backlash, but it was by far the safest and the best option, the one that probably led to a better balance to the game. Which is why the decision was genius.